Some truths heal a family, but some truths open a door that should have stayed closed. Last night, James finally revealed what he has been carrying for years: the fear, the scars, and the shadow of a father who refuses to release control. But what neither James nor Tu Diep realized is that speaking a secret out loud can sometimes awaken the very thing you're trying to escape. Because this morning, before the sun even touched the bamboo grove, Officer Ly discovered something. Something that suggests Tran's son is not just watching, he's already moving. A strange phone call, a missing record, a man seen near the border checkpoint who shouldn't be there, and a warning that arrived too late. While James tries to recover inside their wooden house, danger is quietly threading its way toward them, step by step, shadow by shadow. And today, you'll learn the first sign that proves Tran's son has finally found their trail. If you're following James and Tu Diep's journey and don't want to miss a single twist, please subscribe. Your support keeps this story alive, and it truly means the world to us. The afternoon sun hung low, spilling long shadows across the wooden porch. Diep sat at the small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm ginger tea she had barely touched. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't bring peace anymore. Inside the bedroom, James lay propped up against pillows, his eyes closed, but his breath uneven. Fever gone, but strength still scattered. Every now and then, he murmured a name. Sometimes Diep's, sometimes his father's. Outside, Don paced across the yard, nose twitching, ears rigid. Not barking this time. Worse. Silent. Alert. Diep pressed a hand over her belly. Even the baby felt still. The moment replayed in her mind over and over. My father has been doing this to me since I was very, very young. James had said it in a whisper, but the weight shattered something inside her. She had always known Tran's son didn't approve of their love, but she never imagined the cruelty that had shaped the man she married. A soft creak came from the bedroom doorway. Diep turned. James stood there, leaning heavily on the bed frame for balance. His face looked pale again, but his eyes were clear, clearer than she had seen in days. Hey, she whispered, rising to help him. You shouldn't be standing. I needed to see you, he said quietly. She slipped an arm around him, guiding him to the wooden chair on the porch. He sat slowly, inhaling sharply as pain shot through his injured leg. For a moment, they didn't speak. The wind rustled the bamboo grove. The shadows shifted. Don's claws scraped the dirt. Finally, James broke the silence. Diep, I'm sorry. She blinked. Sorry? For what? For bringing him into your life. James stared at his hands, jaw tight. For letting the past reach you. For letting him follow you. For letting this fear touch our home. Diep shook her head immediately, holding his face in both hands. James, none of this is your fault. You didn't choose your father. You didn't choose what he did to you. But it's affecting you now, he whispered. It's affecting us, she corrected softly. And we face it together. His eyes glistened. Before he could respond, Don growled, low, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. Diep's spine stiffened. James straightened in his chair. Is someone there? Diep scanned the path that led through the bamboo trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then, crunch. A single footstep, measured, heavy, not the sound of an animal, not the wind. Diep's breath hitched. Another crunch. Closer. Don barked once, sharp enough to make James flinch. Dip whispered, "Stay here," and stood, heart pounding. But James caught her wrist. No, not alone. Before either of them could decide what to do, Ly appeared at the gate, stepping out from the shade of the bamboo grove just as a shadow slipped behind him. Dip nearly collapsed in relief. "Officer Ly," she called, but her relief died the second she saw his face. He was tense, more tense than she had ever seen him. One hand hovered dangerously close to the baton at his belt. "Dip," he said calmly, "get James inside." "Why? What happened?" she whispered. James tried to stand. "Ly, did you see someone in the grove?" Ly held up a hand sharply. "Inside, now." But before they could move, another sound shattered the air. Thud. Something hit the outer fence. Not strong enough to break it, but deliberate enough to send chills down their spines. Dip instinctively placed both hands over her belly. James gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. Ly stepped in front of them, voice low. "He's closer than I expected." Dip's voice crackled. "Who?" Ly turned slowly toward them. "The man who's been watching this house." James felt the world tilt, not from fever, from recognition. "You saw him?" James whispered. Ly nodded once. "I didn't get a full look, but tall build, dark clothing, moved like someone trained, not a villager. He was following the path that leads toward your yard." Dip covered her mouth. Ly continued, "But he stopped when he saw me. He waited in the shadows, watching, testing if he could get closer to the house." James's breath shook. "My father's man." "Or your father himself," Ly said quietly. Dip grabbed the porch railing to steady herself. Ly's eyes flicked between them, then to James. "Now I need you to tell me everything you didn't finish earlier. All of it, because the more I know about him, the better chance we have of staying ahead of him." James closed his eyes. For a moment, Dip feared he wouldn't be able to speak at all. But then he opened them, and the fear in them had changed. Not of his father, of losing his family. "I'll tell you," he said finally. Ly nodded. "Start with the worst thing he ever did." James swallowed hard. "When I was 11, he whispered, something happened at home. Something I prayed I would never have to say out loud again." Dip sat beside him instantly, holding his trembling hand. He continued, voice raw. "One night, I heard crying from the downstairs hall. I thought it was my mother. But when I followed the sound, I found one of Father's workers, a young man, terrified, pleading." Ly's expression hardened. Dip's grip tightened. James's voice dropped to almost nothing. And my father was standing over him. Calm, too calm. He told the man that loyalty was everything, that betrayal had a price. James looked up, eyes hollow. "That night, I learned that fear wasn't something my father reacted to." He swallowed. "It was something he created." Silence engulfed the porch. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Ly leaned forward. "James," he said quietly, "that's not just cruelty. That's method. That's habit. And it means he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Dip whispered, "What does he want?" Ly didn't hesitate. "You." James's heart dropped. "Not because of love," Ly added, "because you disobeyed him. Because you chose a life without him. Because you chose Dip." Dip felt James's fingers dig into her palm, and Ly delivered the final blow. "Everything he's doing now is exactly what he did to you as a child. Only this time, He glanced at Dip's belly. "He's doing it to your family." James let out a shaky breath. "I thought the footsteps were ghosts," he whispered. Ly shook his head. "They were never ghosts." James looked at Dip. "They were always him," she finished softly. The bamboo grove rustled again, louder this time. Dawn barked. Ly stood instantly, hand on his baton. Dip grabbed James's arm, and James whispered the words that would carry this arc forward. "He's not going to stop, Dip. Not until I stop him." For a long moment, no one on the porch moved. Ly stood with his back half turned toward the bamboo grove, every muscle on alert. Dip knelt beside James, her hand steady over his. James stared into the shadows swaying between the tall bamboo stalks, not with fear, but with a grim, quiet understanding. The past wasn't chasing him anymore. It had arrived. Dip whispered, "James, sit down. You're pushing yourself too hard." But he didn't sit. His entire body trembled. From exhaustion, yes, but also from something sharper. Resolve. "I'm done running," he said, eyes fixed on the grove. "If he's come this far, he won't leave until he thinks he's broken us. I can't let that happen. Not to you. Not to our child." Dip swallowed, voice barely a breath. "You don't have to face him alone." Before James could respond, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. Not blood, not rust, cologne. Dip's eyes widened. "That smell, it's not from around here." Ly's hand tightened on his baton. "Good nose, Dip. That confirms it. Whoever's out there isn't a villager." James felt his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. That cologne. He hadn't smelled it in years, but he knew it. Rich, sharp, imported. The same scent that clung to his father's suits. The same scent that used to fill the corridors of the Tran household. Dip felt James's entire body stiffen beneath her hands. "What is it?" she whispered. James's voice cracked. "He's close." The leaves parted. Dip gasped, stepping back instinctively. But the figure that stepped into view wasn't towering or monstrous. It was a man in simple clothes, face half hidden by a hood, shoulders uneven from carrying something heavy earlier. Not big, but not weak either. His posture was wrong, too straight, too controlled. Ly immediately positioned himself between the porch and the stranger. "Stop right there," he barked. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze. Dip's heart pounded. James reached for the porch railing, pulling himself upright despite the stabbing pain in his leg. The man lifted his head, not fully, just enough for Ly to catch a glimpse. Ly inhaled sharply. "You're not from this village," he said, voice low. The man didn't answer, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Dip whispered, "James, do you know him?" James studied the man's stance, the rigid shoulders, the faint tremble in the fingers. Then he went pale. I think he's one of Father's drivers." Ly's eyes narrowed slightly. "That would match what I saw earlier. Someone trained, someone following orders." The man's jaw clenched, and without warning, he ran, not toward them, back into the bamboo grove. Dip startled. "Ly! I'm on him!" Ly bolted after the man, sprinting so fast the dust spiraled behind him. Dawn followed instantly, barking with a fury Dip had never heard before. The grove swallowed them in seconds. The house fell silent again. But James's world tilted. Dip rushed to catch him as he collapsed back into the chair, breathing hard. "James, you shouldn't have stood up." He shut his eyes, gripping her wrist tightly. "That wasn't just any driver," he whispered hoarsely. "He used to pick me up from school when I was younger." Diep froze. "What?" "He wasn't dangerous then," James said through clenched teeth. "Just quiet, obedient. Father trusted him. Too much." Diep's mind spun. "If your father sent him..." James looked at her, and the pain on his face wasn't from his injured leg. He never sends people unless he wants something, or wants to take something away. Minutes dragged by like hours. Diep paced the porch, hands shaking. Inside, Nee played quietly with Don's empty collar, unaware of the danger creeping around their family. Mrs. Huyen whispered prayers under her breath, each word trembling. Finally, footsteps, real ones, heavy, rushed, coming from the path, not the grove. Diep ran to the gate. "Lee!" The officer emerged, panting, shirt dirt-streaked, baton drawn but empty-handed. "You didn't catch him?" James asked, struggling upright again. Lee shook his head. "He knows the grove too well, and he's trained. He didn't run randomly. He was leading me away from the house." Diep felt her stomach drop. "So there could be someone else near the house right now?" Lee didn't answer. Which was the answer? He checked the yard perimeter first, the back shed, the old water tank, the cooking area. Then he returned to the porch, face grim. He wasn't alone. Diep's breath hitched. James gripped the chair so hard the wood creaked. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. Lee held up a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Careful not to touch it directly. It was tiny, metal, crushed into the dirt behind the house. Diep leaned closer. "A button?" "No," James whispered. Recognition hit him like a punch. "That's from a suit sleeve. Father's suits look exactly like that." Lee nodded. "Which means your father isn't just sending people." Diep's heart stopped. "He's here," Lee finished. Or he was. James felt something collapse inside him. "If he's watching us," James whispered, "we need to know why. Why now? Why so aggressively? What does he want from us?" Lee exhaled slowly. "That's what I tried asking you before." James stared at the dirt, at the button, at the memories he never wanted to revisit. He rubbed his trembling hands together. "My father. He believes loyalty must be earned through fear." Diep swallowed hard. "And you left him," Lee said quietly. "You built a life without him. That alone is enough reason for a man like him to lash out." James nodded once. Then after a long silence, he added something he had never told anyone, not even Diep. "There's another reason." Diep's eyes lifted. "What reason?" James hesitated. Then finally, voice barely more than a breath, "Because the last person who tried to leave him disappeared." Diep covered her mouth. Lee's expression hardened to steel. "James," he said, "if your father is willing to hurt his own child to keep control, then we're not dealing with a family problem anymore." He stepped closer. "We're dealing with a man who thinks he owns you." James's hand shook. "He can't have us," Diep whispered fiercely. James looked into her eyes, full of fear, but stronger than ever. "He won't," he said. And then, with a voice that stabbed straight into the core of the story, "But if he wants to destroy this family, he'll come in person." The bamboo grove rustled, not with wind, with warning. In this episode, the fragile calm inside James and Tu Diep's wooden house begins to crumble. Though James finally reveals the painful truth about his father's control, The confession only opens the door to a deeper danger. While James tries to recover, Officer Lee uncovers disturbing clues. A missing file from border security, a strange phone call traced to an unknown number, and a man spotted near the checkpoint who matches someone from Tran Sun's past. Diep senses something is wrong when Dawn growls toward the bamboo grove, but the real threat is already closer than she thinks. Shadows move where no one should be, and signs appear that someone has been watching their home. By the end of the episode, one chilling fact becomes clear. Tran Sun has found their trail, and he's coming.